This is Synthesis TV, keeping you on the edge of technology and business.
Artificial intelligence and the future of humans. Do we even have a future? Well, I've got good news for you. But before we get into it, on behalf of Synthesis TV, a huge welcome to our digital fireside chat. I'm your host, Andrew McElroy from Responsive, and today I've got a very special guest on the digital line, sitting in Amsterdam, Tom Wells, who is the Chief Disruption Officer for Synthesis Labs. Welcome, Tom. Good to have you.
Thanks, Andrew. Thank you for having me, man. It's very, very cool to take part. Is this your first fireside chat? Is that what you're calling this?
You are breaking ground. So here we go. Anything can happen.
That is awesome. I'm so jealous of your background, I have to admit. I'm going to have to do the research to figure out how you did that.
It's all about technology. Tom, let's do an icebreaker, or should I call it a fire starter? You're pumping out the good stuff. What's your drug of choice? Being an Amsterdam man, is it Red Bull or is it Monster? This Monster actually says Lewis on it. Max, being a local Dutch or a UK
it's such
representative.
So do I have? Oh, it's so difficult. I think in my youth, I used to definitely like it would be the Red Bull. I think I would pick. But in my age now, it's almost like I can't tolerate any of these things. Actually, that I've had to reduce my coffee intake down to 1 cup of coffee a day. Otherwise, I literally cannot process those things. It's sad.
I suppose when it gets to that point, you have to make sure that it's a good cup of coffee.
Well, that's right, yeah. And unfortunately, the Dutch coffee scene is non-existent. So that means having good coffee brewing technology at home, unfortunately.
Hey, it's early days. We'll get there. My favorite is a triple shot cappuccino with oat milk. So that's my latest drug of choice. On occasional, a Monster here and there.
Really? Wow, I'm very impressed. You must have an amazing metabolism.
Well, it's a work in progress for sure. Well, free tip for success: surround yourself with people who are smarter than you. That's exactly what I've done here today with my guest, Tom. Tom, you and the labs team, you've recently launched Galactica CLI, which is either spin-off from Battlestar Galactica or Meta's discontinued Galactica AI software. And I must let you know, I've had it play. I generated some regex for validation. It told me a joke, even wrote some content. Am I even needed? Am I obsolete? Pretty much sums up my day. A little bit of validation, check this, check that, tell a few bad jokes, and then write some content, send some emails. You certainly made my life easier. But tell us a bit about Galactica, the vision, the tech stack, the story behind it.
Yeah, awesome. So I think we all jumped in when ChatGPT came out, and everyone started playing with it and found that there was just millions of use cases. Right, you could have it write emails, check your work, write articles, tell you a joke, tell your children bedtime stories, etc., etc., etc. And so, one of my earliest frustrations with it was, although it's hugely valuable, I just found it difficult to integrate with kind of like my flow, right? I spend a lot of time when I'm in my programming mode, I spend a lot of time in the terminal, switching between terminal tools and an editor, right? And I just found it pretty tiresome to cut and paste code into the ChatGPT window. And so one of the earliest things for me was I wish I could just cat my file into this thing and ask a question about that thing. And so that's really where Galactica was born. And I call it Galactica now. We've kind of renamed it to Galactic AI, only really because we could get the domain name galacticai.co. And so it's being slowly renamed to Galactic AI, I guess. But I think right now the idea of it is just, hey, we think it's pretty cool and it's pretty useful for developers in the terminal to do a whole bunch of stuff. If you want to automate code reviewing or checking your Git commit messages or whatever it is, you kind of want it in your terminal because it's easy to cut and paste to, pipe data to, etc. It just feels closer to me as a terminal user when I can execute it from the terminal. So that's what it is today. I do think as part of the development of Galactica, we also had to build a whole interesting backend around prompt engineering and managing those prompts and the access into OpenAI in order to move to the next model. And of course, like for today, I think we released it last night, that GPT-4 is now available in Galactica. So you can now, if you use Galactica today, it doesn't matter when you installed it, you will now be using GPT-4 as the underlying model. And so effectively, we're keeping the back end up to date with all the kind of the latest large language models, etc. We could even pivot to other models. We don't have to use OpenAI. We could use Google's Bard or whatever into the future. But you continue to use Galactica on the CLI, and you'll just get all that benefit sort of out the box without having to upgrade it and switch platforms. So that's what it is today. But there was a lot of work around the back end and all the prompt engineering, which I think was a really good test for us in the labs team to show the capability of what we can achieve. And so from a synthesis or responsive perspective or group perspective, we just sort of, it's a really good case study in us building something using a large language model, which if we find customers out there who have similar requirements, we can kind of just leverage the work that we've done in Galactica as well. So yeah, that's some
Very
background.
exciting. I love the ChatGPT integration. I mean, that's fresh off the boat. Have you seen any exciting or maybe left field use cases that were surprising to you? I know it's early days.
Well, almost anyone I speak to and show it to kind of comes up with a novel use case. Maybe none of them are hugely groundbreaking, but often they're just like, oh, wow, that's a great use case. So for example, one of our graduates, Ben Pillay, I'm not sure how he got access to Galactic, but it was in the fairly early first few days of us putting it on a GitHub release. He started playing with it, and he actually submitted his first pull request. He was the first pull request we received on Galactica, and he just sort of quickly hacked together an example of using Galactica to write your Git commit comments. So he just built a Git pre-commit hook, which called Galactica. So anytime he goes Git commit on the command line, it goes first to Galactica to ask it, hey, what would you write if this was your commit? And it passes the diff to Galactica, and Galactica then summarizes and says, oh, you've changed these files and for these reasons, and it sort of summarizes your commit before, and then presents that to you as the developer, which you can then edit or just choose to commit blindly if you like. So, I mean, that was just like such a cool use case that we never thought about. And it just came about because one of our graduates picked it up, hacked it in, submitted a pull request, and suddenly we were like, wow, yeah, that's a great feature. Just an awesome feature. And that's exactly, I think, like the kind of thing we would like to see Galactica doing more and more. Just these kind of very small and fairly arbitrary pieces of development just makes you 1% more efficient. And I think that's all we're kind of after.
Yeah, excellent. I mean, it's certainly early days, but to see the traction already, and like you say, introduce it into your workflow and benefit from those optimizations, be a little more efficient, a little more productive. I suppose on the one hand, you have people who are quite scared of this new technology, whether they will be made obsolete over time. And I mean, do you have any advice for, let's call it, sticking within the technology landscape with developers, wannabe developers, or maybe even mature developers, whether they should be embracing tools like ChatGPT, Galactica, or whether they should try and find a niche within the space? Do you have any pearls of wisdom?
Yeah, I've got a lot of thoughts around it, and I don't think I've got the answer yet. I think fortunately for a company such as ours in our group, we are fortunate that we are generally a collection of early adopters of technology. I think that's just, it's probably something to do with the profile of general developers are typically on the innovation or early adopter side of the spectrum. And so in my view, we've got to be picking these tools up and using them as much as possible, not in order to make our jobs easier or quicker, but it's to understand how they work as well, so that we can change the way we use them, and remain in control of them, and remain in control of the outputs that they produce, right? So that we can curate them, make sure that they're correct. And I think in the short to medium term, that feels like a good approach, and it doesn't feel like that is automating away our jobs as developers yet. I mean, long term, there is potential of this, right? But like we really have not enough information yet to see, how far up the curve we are around this technology. I mean, you have two sides of the argument. Some people who are on this is going to be as limited around creativity as language allows us to be, right? This is something that's been trained purely on language, and so how creative could it possibly be? There's that side of the spectrum saying it's actually limited really to language. And then you see the other side of the spectrum where you're starting to see these glimpses of what you could describe as general AI starting to emerge from these language models, where this thing is solving problems, or it is actively seems to be learning the good strategies for playing chess, etc., etc. I mean, there's hundreds of examples where you're seeing these language models doing something that's a little bit more than just understanding text. And it's hard to know where we will land on that spectrum. It seems to be we're pushing higher than the minimum for sure. It's not just a language model, but how much further towards artificial general intelligence does it get us? And who's to know? Who's to know?
Yeah, it's certainly an interesting debate. But what I'm hearing from you say is that we should be introducing these tools into our workflow, get a head start, and find out how we can benefit from them. And so
Definitely,
it's definitely,
yes.
Yeah, I think we're on the precipice of something fantastic, and you're right on the forefront of it with Galactic. And if you had to take a moonshot at the future, do you see anything maybe that we haven't considered, which could be a future possibility with this technology where it could evolve to?
I think one of the very interesting things that it's quite contemporary, I suppose, and this is something that Mike, no doubt, is fascinated by, is these things right now are request response, and they sit within this domain where they are generating text. That's really all they're doing. They're not really, they have no ability to execute yet. It's not connected, like GPT-4 is not connected to the internet. It can't actually execute a search query. It can't actually execute code. It can't build something. It can't talk to AWS. It has no ability, or it has no agency, I suppose is the word you would use. It is just, you pass it some text and it'll pass you back some resultant text. I think the interesting next big step is when these things have the ability to have a direct effect on the world, where you could say to it, please, can you do this thing? And it actually goes and performs that thing. That's where I think we cross into this potentially very exciting or very dangerous perspective, where this thing now has the ability to act. Right now, it doesn't, right? It's almost like it's really good at producing you a recipe. You still have to go and bake the cake. It doesn't yet have the ability to bake the cake, right? It has got the recipe, but it's not connected in a way that it can actually act on that information. I think that connecting it to giving it that ability will be the next huge step change in these things.
Yeah, awesome. I love that perspective. I think one of the use cases that I've seen maybe more of a limitation is where businesses want to incorporate a tool like ChatGPT to serve within their operations or their clients, but they've got a need to really serve accurate data. And we know ChatGPT, it's got a huge database, it's got a lot of outputs, but not always there is that margin for error. So how do you see organizations bridging that gap?
Yeah, and it's like a hugely big problem. So these models are not yet, I mean, maybe they're at 80 to 90% good around their accuracy, but it's very difficult to know when these models are just making stuff up, right? And there's so many examples of where they have just made stuff up. So, I mean, fundamentally, it's just predicting the next word in a string of text, and it's like if you ask it to do, and it has no ability to know what the fundamental truth is in the text that it has processed. It's seen a lot of text. Some of it could be accurate, some may not be accurate. And when you ask it to generate things, it's just going to use the most likely next few words to generate it. So a lot of the time, it feels like GPT is trying to please you. So when I ask for something, it wants to return the most pleasing result to me, which may not be necessarily the most truthful one, right? And so I think that's a huge problem from an enterprise adoption perspective. It's pretty useful, I think, for an individual right now, especially when you're an expert in your own domain and you're asking questions of that domain. You can curate the answers GPT-4 gives you, and you can go, yes, this feels good. And I can also independently validate it with Google or my traditional search. But I think when it comes to adoption and an enterprise perspective, and where that enterprise is starting to make that system available to its end consumers, where maybe there is no ability to curate on the other side, and it's taken as a gospel truth, that would be hugely risky. And it's not something that I would say you should do today, not with some guardrails around. So I think wherever you're keeping the human in the loop, that's a good use case today. But taking the human cannot be taken out of the loop just yet. If it is something of critical importance, then certainly not. But I do feel over time, it's a gap that I feel will close more and more. It has already, from GPT-3, 3.5 to now GPT-4, you're already seeing that accuracy gap almost come down like quite linearly. And so you kind of wonder, well, if GPT-5 and GPT-6 and GPT-7 are closing the gap at that rate, eventually we will get to something that is close to zero from an error perspective.
And potentially organizations can enhance that data with their own internal data so that they can try and narrow the gap over time as well. One of the interesting use cases that I've heard about is an government organization, actually taking chat conversations, feeding it into ChatGPT to read sentiment, and then defining whether their call center agents are doing a great job or not, whether they're working up the clients or not. So there's definitely a use case. Maybe, yes, the accuracy needs to get there, but still a valid tool and some creative options where we can introduce it. So well done for pioneering.
Absolutely. Yes, thank you. Yeah. And please continue to adopt and use and give back feedback. Like it's an open project. I think from a group perspective, everyone is invited to play with it, add to it. Comments and feedback welcome.
Yeah, open source. We'll share the link in the comments. Have a play. There's actually some great case or examples you've put in there, so that was quite helpful. You just have to remember to type the login. That was my first mistake.
Right.
I didn't log in, and then
right.
Anyway, newbie era.
We're learning. Yeah.
But very easy to use and very quick responses, and I think very useful and practical. And I think it can definitely evolve into some very exciting practical use cases that will enhance everyday life, especially as a developer who's used to CLI, command line interface. I mean, I think you touched on something else, which I think is also a little bit of a hot potato, especially with the recent debate with TikTok, which is this digital ethics and AI. I don't know if you have any thoughts around AI and how we can create some healthy digital ethics as we navigate this new technology going forward. I mean, BBC, for example, they called that debate bruising, damaging, and relentless. Ouch. So it's certainly top of mind at the moment. And I think a good question is, where do we draw the boundaries? And who determines them?
Yeah. I'm certainly not an expert in this. I'd love to hear your view as well. But I mean, it's such a difficult one because you have these kind of geopolitical boundaries where you've got, different countries who have different objectives. You've got the USA, you've got Europe, you've got Africa, you've got China, Russia, etc. They all have different perspectives on how they see this thing going. And even within, even like the American one, you've got the left wing, right wing, etc. And they almost seem to have differing views on these things. And it feels to me like quite geopolitically incompatible. And then I think you also have commercial versus maybe community. You've got, a lot of AI has come, all of it has come out of the academic community, which I think in the past sort of 50 years has been very open and very collaborative and very highly communicative with each other, but maybe quite insular and quite isolated into its space. And now you see OpenAI starting out being very open and very, very much part of that academic community, has now shifted very rapidly into much more of a commercial and closed entity. And so there you have, like, again, different views around how do we now go from something which maybe is easy to define in an academic sphere around ethics, because it's being quite open and transparent, to now something which is now commercially very important. And ethics means something different, I think, once you apply money to it, right? So I think it's just a hugely complex and difficult one, and I don't think there's a single solution. And maybe it emerges through its kind of use cases, and maybe we do see government regulations kind of taking the lead there. But what is your perspective on it, Andrew?
It's certainly evolving, and I can't say that I have any wisdom on the topic other than it can't, that, call it, last layer of defense can't rest with any one individual, nor any one organization, or maybe even a government. I think there's definitely privacy concerns, there's government legislation, regulation, that kind of get the feel of something like the United Nations, where you have a number of layers and interested parties collaborating to set those healthy guidelines that protect users and protect humanity. So
well, exactly right.
I think it's got a long ways to go, and hopefully we can start agreeing on some basic broad principles that can govern the technology and really limit the exposure to the dark side of what's possible. But it seems like we're off to a healthy start, but I think it's important that we do stay on top of those ethics conversations.
Yeah, quite right. Because it's probably not that often that we get these kind of human existential things appearing. Maybe the last one was like nuclear technology or nuclear war was the last big threat of human existence. And that seemed to be, I don't know, I wasn't around at the time, but I think, we're all still here. So I think humans are capable of doing this, right? It just does, as you say, take a lot of effort. And maybe, nuclear was very obvious in its threat. This thing has a very direct impact on humanity, just through its like explosive nature. Whereas maybe AI doesn't show that clearly, that it has this like direct human threat to it, when potentially it does. I don't know. So maybe it's a bit more of a subtle, a subtle threat. So yeah. Good.
Yeah, absolutely. I think for me personally, one of the biggest takeaways from the TikTok debate was government officials concerned, yes, about the legal side, but really around the humanitarian aspect, how people could really get hurt through the technology and how we protect users. And I think we have to keep that in mind. It can't purely be driven by legislation. But, there's a human aspect to us all, and it has to be guarded. So, yeah, certainly interesting, and we'll see where it goes. But Tom, moving on to the tech stack, I know you've been playing with Rust. And for those of you who haven't heard, Rust is a doorway into the multiverse. I mean, I looked it up on Wikipedia. It said it's a multi-paradigm programming language. What does that even mean? And what are your impressions?
What does that even mean? Andrew, I am such a programming language nerd, man. I know what it is, but I'm like really obsessed with programming languages. It's just, and over my career, I've become more and more obsessed. Actually, it's actually maybe bridges onto the unhealthy. I think sometimes that I find myself talking to people around language, and I get like no response. And I go, how are they not excited about this? This new equals sign that's being introduced. Anyway. So, I mean, Rust for me is like, yeah, it's awesome. I love it. So what does multi-paradigm mean? Multi-paradigm means it's a language which you can use in different styles. So you have the imperative style is a very big one. Imperative means you write lines of code that follow one after the other. It's imperative. So it means it's talking about doing things. You do things in a particular order. That's what imperative means. In that domain of languages, you have again, other styles. So you have object-oriented, for example. An object-oriented language is kind of an imperative language, but you use it in a slightly different style. And then you have functional languages, which are again a different kind. Where often it's not clear enough. It's not always true that in a functional language that the order of operations is the order that they are written in your source code. You know, if you have a function with 3 statements, in most languages, that means you'll do the first one, then the second, and then the third. In a purely functional language, first of all, you can't really there's no such concept of this thing, then that thing after that as lines of code. Often the way the program executes is it reduces down to the solution. So it'll just execute almost like the way you would with maths. You would mathematically reduce an equation down to its most simplest form. That doesn't necessarily have to follow a particular order that you do that. You can reduce things in different orders depending on, and some things may not execute at all if they're not used in the final solution. So when Rust talks about it being multi-paradigm, it means it's got little bits of all of that stuff. So it's up to you as a programmer to choose in which way you would like to write your program. So it makes it just really flexible, I suppose. As opposed to a language like Java, which is an imperative object-oriented language. I have to follow the object-oriented kind of approach. I can't break out of that and say, actually, I want to write this thing as just a set of modules with functions or something. I suppose I could, but I would still have to work within the constraints of object orientation. Whereas Rust has no, fundamentally, it just has a main method and you can build up whatever you like. If you want to write objects, that's fine, do that. If you would just like modules and functions, you can do that. You can be fairly functional as well, not entirely functional, but you can sort of do the basics of functional programming as well in Rust.
Yeah, I love that flexibility you're talking about. I think you obviously touched on the concurrency aspect, but one of the standout features for me was this performance. Have you seen that personally in some of your projects?
Yeah, so one of the things I love about Rust, and actually the first language I really used professionally was C and C++ in a military context. So I wrote a lot of C and C++, and I did love that language. I loved it. It was just really, you had to be in the mode of when you had to be very careful. So when you wrote code, you couldn't be kind of haphazard around passing things around. You always had to be thinking quite carefully about who owns this piece of memory. And when I spin up a thread, am I reading and writing to the right? Am I allowed to have the shared resource, that kind of thing? And so Rust for me feels like it's as exciting a language as C and C++, except it's just smarter around knowing when you're doing the wrong thing around memory or concurrency. And at the end of the day, you also get the result is that you're using a language that compiles down to a very efficient form, meaning that it is competing with the performance of C and C++ at the lowest level, but that you've got this kind of safety on the top that you can be a little lazy as a programmer. You can go, I don't really care what's happening with this memory. I'm just going to chuck it around. And the compiler will check that for you. So before in C and C++, if you were haphazard with your memory, you compiled, it would compile fine. And when it ran, it would explode or memory leak or crash or whatever. And so and then it was really impossible to debug those problems. A lot of the times it's very difficult to debug. Whereas with Rust, you can be haphazard in the writing of the code, but the compiler will make sure that you make zero mistakes around memory and concurrency, which is a really beautiful property to have. So it's as efficient as C and C++ or very close to, but without any of the pitfalls of those languages. So I find that really exciting, but it also means it's very low level in what it's useful for. So it's useful in the domains where you would want to choose C and C++. So they call it the systems programming language. So where you would writing an operating system or you're writing something which needs to be highly performant. It doesn't feel quite as high level as a high level language around memory. You're still having to say, yes, this is a reference to this object versus I'm passing it the object. You know, there's lower level syntax to deal with memory that you do have to deal with. So, but I find it very useful as a general language. It feels like one I think I could adopt as probably my go-to language for most problems. It feels like it's a language
that's a big
space.
call right there. Did everyone hear that? Go-to language. Wow. I love it. I mean, like you said, the flexibility.
I think it even has a go-to statement. I think you can do a go-to in Rust even.
Yeah, I think one of the secrets when you know there's a great technology programming language coming up on the horizon is when it's well adopted.
Yeah.
And that's certainly the case with Rust. In fact, I was reading that the community, they call them Rustaceans. So, I mean, I don't know if you ever have an identity crisis where you feel like a lab rat in part of synthesis labs and a Rustacean. And I like they've got some of these guiding principles. Being reliable, performant, supportive, productive, transparent, versatile. I think these are fantastic and just shows, hey, there's a very active, vibrant community giving it the traction it deserves. And you're actually proving it, building up real life production projects, which you're testing the metal and having a great experience.
Yeah, absolutely. And that I think, I mean, I think we have tested in a number of projects that there is really a good set of like ecosystem libraries out there. So like most things seem to be out there and kind of actively being maintained, which is awesome, right? So you've got like all of your, you know, it's all the common stuff. You need connectivity to a database. You need the database drivers to work for a bunch of different databases, or connections for Apache Kafka, or you need et cetera, all that kind of stuff seems to be out there and pretty actively built, but it is still fairly new in its life. So it's, you know, maybe it's less than 10 years old, and so you can't expect to find a completely mature ecosystem yet. The language itself is also actively changing. I think there are new language features coming out certainly more rapidly than you see in other more mainstream languages as well. So there's definitely, it feels, so, you know, there is going to be a little bit of an unstable ride, I think, adopting Rust. But I would say for most projects, most fairly standard organized projects, it seems to be completely good.
And what is the upskill like? And, you know, for a humble front-end developer, what's your thoughts on getting up to speed and really adding value with Rust?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I suppose we have to look at, like, I'm the worst sample because I picked it up very quickly. It felt very comfortable to me. Within a week or two, I was on top of it. There were just a few things which I'd never seen before in another language. There's a completely different memory model called the ownership model, which I'd never seen. And I've spent a lot of time with a lot of languages. I've seen a lot of different things. And the ownership memory model is something very novel in the Rust space. And so that took a bit of time to get used to. But that was kind of the only thing I needed to fill in my knowledge from. Everything else just feels like a pretty good version of a feature I've seen elsewhere, you know. And so I think it was fairly easy for me to adopt it. I'm a terrible sample. I think it's definitely.
You are an edge case, Tom.
Maybe. And I love these kinds. So I practice getting up to speed quickly in languages. So it's something I'm like quite good at. But For example, Mike Grant on my team he's a Python guy, right? He comes from the the AI machine learning world. So of course, Python is like the dominant language, and he's a Python guy. And he picked up Rust like pretty quickly, like he's on top of it. And there he's moving from Python, which is a sort of an interpreted, very coercive kind of language. It tolerates a lot of funny stuff around typings, to Rust, which is first of all compiled and strictly typed and compiled, a very different language. And we're along this journey, I think we've tried to remain as functional as possible. So I'm a functional programmer. That's what I like, writing in the functional style. That's just me. And unfortunately, working on my team, we're going to tend to be more functional in the way we build. So Mike changed a lot of his paradigms and picked it up quickly, right? As of today, I'd say he's an expert Rust person. It would be really good to get his opinion on yes, how he feels about it.
But I do think Michael to the next podcast for sure.
Yeah,
he's also an edge case.
A good idea.
Both of you, you're very smart programmers with a wealth and depth of experience. You are the Tom API with a very deep well of information. So yeah, Tom, thanks for allowing us to tap into that big brain of yours and just see what you've been up to. It's certainly very exciting. And I love the passion. It's really oozing out of you, and it's very contagious. May it never change. Let's finish with a toasty, sticky marshmallow on the fire. It's time for a tasty treat.
Yeah. So, I could tell you something that in the earliest parts of my career, someone I really looked up to in my first job told me and gave me his advice. He was very much a programming god as I perceived him. But he said to me, in order to become a master of anything, you need to master that thing as well as one level deeper. And I think that is stuck with me almost my whole career, that it's if you want to get good at something, whatever it is, blockchain, AI, ML, Rust, programming, whatever it is, you've got to become a master of that thing. And then you have to understand how the one thing that enables that thing beneath it as well. And only then can you, and the beauty of it is it's very recursive, right? So as you master something, you also have to master the thing beneath it, which means that you've got to and then when you master that thing, you've got to master the thing beneath that, right? So it's this kind of recursive definition, I suppose.
Wow. Bank that. Go deep. Master a skill and then go deep. Multi-layered. I love it. And maybe just last thought on that. What's your thoughts on going wide versus going deep with your skill set?
You just have to do both.
Yes. That's not intimidating
unfortunately.
For anyone. Oh, brilliant.
Yeah,
Tom, thanks so much. It's been really great picking your brains today, and it's been very informative, insightful, and the passion is certainly energizing. Who needs a monster?
Exactly.
Well, I hope these tech insights have brightened up your day. Keep the fire burning. Don't get rusty with your skills. Give Rust a test drive. Give Galactica a go, because the future is here. Thank you for joining us today.